Rio is that there were two Rios. There was a Rio that, when I came back to the United States, I found out there was a Rio that was being broadcast on the networks and on the cables. And then there was the Rio that I was actually at, and about which there was basically not a word said, ever. And I haven't really heard anything publicly that took place there. And I think that's the way things seem to be at the United Nations in important events that take place there. There's this big hoopla, this big public spectacle on the outside, and the real decisions and the real conversations are had on the inside. And this was a great shock to me. I went there with starry eyes. I would say I grew up as an environmentalist, a very tree-hugging person. And so I thought that this might be hopeful. And believing in the goodness of human nature, I thought that most people like clean air, clean water, and maybe a tree or two. So I thought that there would be some consensus around the globe that maybe those things were worth protecting. And when I got there, I was in for a big shock. The first shock I had was looking at the streets of Rio de Janeiro, which were empty. And big thoroughfares were cleared up. And I soon found out from some insiders that the president had ordered his people to go out and clean up the street people, the homeless people, the street children in particular, who were admittedly a menace, but they're still human beings, and they were cleaned up in a very sort of Gestapo fashion and put into a small concentration camp where they were also shot in very large numbers. So this is true, and I have heard that trickle out into the media since, but not very loudly. So I had this spectacle of empty streets, and there was a curfew on all the residents of Rio, which is a very big city, as you know, and a lot of people doing business and commerce there, and you wonder what happened to all of them. We got there to a place that was very, very far from the city, isolated, highly securitized, and levels of security. And once we got in there, we were basically let loose on the governments of the world. And there were delegations, there were 70 heads of state, all the governments were represented, and people were mingling and chatting, and that was fun. After a few hours, we ended up sitting in a large hall, and people started making speeches. And speeches were usually 20 minutes long, sometimes 35. I didn't keep count. But at the very first speech, I started becoming annoyed. And it started out like this. Oh, we love the environment. Mother Earth is important. These things are sacred. We need to do something about this. We are polluting the earth. And then that was the beginning of the speech. It sounded lovely, very poetic. Then the body of the speech was, the United States has to pay for all this. And if the United States doesn't pay for all this, for us to clean up our nest, then we will continue to defecate in our own nest indefinitely. Therefore, the United States will have to pay for this. And there was a lot of political stuff said about why that should be true, and how developed countries owe undeveloped countries this, that, and the other thing, and how they were, the usual. But, and then it would end up with the closing statement about how they were simply not going to do anything about their own dirt if, not the developed world, the United States paid for it. So then the next person would come up, and we had this procession of African countries, we had Asian countries, we had all sorts of people coming and going, and they all said the same thing, and I started to wonder, do they all have talking points? What's going on here? And I was getting increasingly uncomfortable, because I care about the environment. And this wasn't about the environment. And I wish I had transcripts of all those speeches. And they were cleverly put. They weren't overtly offensive at first, but as they built their arguments, I tried to understand what it is they were saying, and sooner or later they'd come to the punchline. The United States of America owes us this, and they are the richest country in the world, consuming 25% of all the resources, and all these other arguments that I'm sure all of you here have heard. And so they're going to have to give us the money to clean up our countries, our particular country, because each person was talking for their own selves. Otherwise, we will continue to pollute our country, and that is going to be bad for all of us. After 3 days of this, or 2 days, I can't remember, my mind was starting to blur with all these identical speeches. I came to the morning, in the late morning when George H.W. Bush was going to speak, and everyone was all excited about this. And I've told Sheila a few times it was a delightful thing for me, but I got to sit next to Barbara Bush in the same row, and I was walking in with another woman, and she was sitting with another woman, and she made eye contact with me, and we had not been introduced, and she looked very welcoming, and she sort of did something like this, and so I just snuck into her row, and there we sat. And that's when her husband came in, and we were all sort of paying a lot of attention, and he strode up to the podium looking unusually angry. He did not smile. He wasn't particularly gracious. He was a commanding presence. It was a shock to everyone there. He didn't have a preamble. He went right into a very strong statement. And I'm going to paraphrase, because I haven't written it down, but the gist of it was, if you think that we are going to destroy our way of life to clean up your mess, you have another thing coming. And the United States of America will not sign this document because it is, it contains false premises, it is designed to undermine our way of life, and we will not put up with it. The speech was 4 or 5 minutes long, maybe 2, maybe 3. It was painfully short, shockingly short. His body language was angry. I think there was some, fist pounding at one point. And I was very proud of him at this point. And I wouldn't have thought that I would have been. When I went there, I would have been very disappointed if someone had told me that that would be the attitude of the United States of America, because I was an environmentalist. But after listening to these talks for 2.5 days, oh my God, yes! That was the only answer that was right. And I was very, very proud. I was sitting there very, very proud. And Wayne asked me what was her reaction, and I could just feel her bristling with pride. Barbara there. She had a smile on her face, but you could just feel like, We never discussed it, of course. We just happened to sit together. And she did leave shortly after the speech, and she was only there for the speech. But that Agenda 21 did not get signed by George H.W. Bush at that conference. And I don't care what anybody said. So what happened, I'd have to go research what happened with it. I think what happened is that people just decided to implement it anyway. Whether the president had signed it or not, I haven't kept track of it. I was so disgusted with it that I figured that we were living in a very strange world. So I'll speak some more in a moment about the United Nations Development Program, but I'd like to ask questions, have you ask questions about Rio. Yeah.
You said something earlier about 2 Rios, what was that?
2 Rios, yes. There were definitely 2 Rios. There was I'm sorry, I'll get back into the camera. There was the United Nations Conference on the Environment in Rio of '92, which took place completely behind closed doors. I've never heard an accurate description of it. I never saw anything about it in the press or anywhere else. People I talked to after I came back to the United States that were interested in it hadn't heard a thing about it. The only thing that anybody heard about was, it was even called something else. I forget what the name was, but it was a bunch of little tents out on Copacabana Beach, And there were tens of thousands of people. They were all singing Kumbaya, and Placido Domingo was there, and there were people who were doing United Nations outreach in South America and doing sustainable coffee, and there were, you know, people who were supporting Alaskan natives fight against whatever was going on up there, and there were thousands. There were many hundreds of these booths, little tents with brochures and knickknacks and people ready to talk to you all about their little causes. And that was the conference in Rio that was televised. There were fireworks and who knows what, because I didn't see it, because I wasn't there. I was inside this super complex that they built with Mega Millions. They built for this particular meeting, which was high security, had no cameras, had no press, had no outsiders. I was in there because I was married to a person who, for many years, has been very high up in the United Nations, UNDP, United Nations Development Program. And I found out that, that people in that position control the destiny of entire countries, to put it not to put a too fine a point on it. And that's why I was in there. And he got me all the right papers and passes, and I was officially I was a consultant to ECOSOC, which is affiliated in some way, I'm not quite sure how, with UNDP, but he was UNDP. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions about what I just said?
It wasn't what it was painted as at all. The United Nations wasn't on our side. It wasn't. They didn't have America's best interests in mind.
It was what?
The United Nations has never been in order to help the United States. It's always been
As a
way
parasite, then.
to infiltrate the United States.
Well, it was anti-American in the extreme, and none of that was ever broadcast, which tells you something. It was also, in my opinion, anti-environmental in the extreme, in the ways I just explained. You know, and all of you here are familiar with the terms redistribution of wealth, and that's one leg of the stool. The other part of it is the desire of every other powerful country in the world to create an alternate universe to the American superpower and to tear it down. So other countries were not mentioned. Other developed nations were not appealed to for help or financial respite, which is usually what you hear when this is discussed publicly. Oh, well, the developed nations should pay for the undeveloped nations, which sounds very, you know, how shall I say, generous. But that's not what this was about. This was about the United States, which really disturbed me greatly.
In the document itself that is out there, the Agenda 21 42 chapter document or something, almost every chapter states directly that developed nations are to assist developing nations in their improvement or in their growth or whatever. So is that document itself from the meeting that you were at?
Yes, the Agenda 21 was the document in question.
Yeah.
I never read it, I never had to read it, because I listened to these 70 delegations, 100 and whatever the number was. I listened to all those delegations, I listened to 70 of them.
I guess the question is, why doesn't it say the United States?
Because that's what they're keeping secret.
Oh, okay.
That's my whole point, you see.
So the public document is not...
Yeah, it's whitewashed.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously, yeah, which is really a shocker, is it not?
It is.
Yeah, it really is a shocker. Because you could almost, I mean, if you were so inclined, if you were sort of progressive, you'd almost understand that that might be a nice thing to do, is to go help the developed nations, and you're a rich, developed country, yeah, let's lend those poor people a hand. But that's not what was going on.
But you can read between the lines.
No, not there. I didn't need to read between the lines.
No, but I say in the document.
You can,
Yeah.
but I was told outright, over and over again, everybody who got up
Some of these countries were Latin American?
These were the ones that I sat through. After a while I just couldn't take it anymore, but the ones that I sat through it was a long parade of African nations. And it was consistent, and I'd go back out and have a cup of coffee, I'd come in, they'd still be doing it. Didn't matter which nation was getting up. So to answer your questions, yes, everybody. All the third world nations were talking like that. All the ones that I listened to, yes.
When the people from Africa were giving their big "Let's Rob the USA Blind" speech,
yes, that one.
what did you get a sense of political orientation of Gambia versus Zaire versus Botswana versus Kenya
everybody.
versus everyone? It was exactly the same.
Everybody had the same talking point.
So if you listened to what they said, then you would draw exactly the same inference about the culture within Nigeria and Chad and so on. You would not know that they were different in any way just from listening to what they said.
From that
right?
point of view, yes.
Okay.
There is a great deal of difference between the cultures in Africa.
Sure.
There's a genetic diversity there that far outperforms the Caucasian genetic diversity. They're extremely diverse from each other. Cultures and languages are extremely diverse. No, there was no diversity in those speeches. They were identical, as far as I could see. They were not literally identical. They were all written by different hands and speechwriters. But they all contained the same talking points. They were so close together that I wondered if they'd all made notes beforehand. It was obvious that there was one source.
Well,
Yes.
Yeah, to follow up that, I mean, it was almost as if there was an orchestration.
Absolutely orchestrated. 100% certain.
Did you ever look into that, or
I didn't have
find
to.
out?
It was so obvious.
who was orchestrating? Or
I'll tell
what
you,
was
yes, I think you'll be able to put it together from my eyewitness account of the next part of this. Yes, because I wouldn't have known just by sitting there who actually did this, but then I was invited to some government visits where the United Nations was designing the fate of entire countries. So I can tell you with some certainty that, well, I'll just tell you the story, because, is it time for that story?
Sure.
All right.
Yes.
It's a good question, though, because it got me thinking, what's going on? Because it was a great shock to me. I don't know if you ever had a wake-up aha moment in your lives. I mean, I grew up in Switzerland, and I was familiar with Euro-communism and anti-Americanism and European socialism. So it's not like I was a complete babe in the woods. But I think that my environmentalism, such as it was naive and untainted. And I made certain assumptions that would transcend politics and that would stand outside these other considerations, which was very foolish of me, considering the Green Movement in Germany is 100% communist, but and admits that. But I thought that the world as a whole would, that I thought the world was a better place. I was mistaken. So this sleuthing of mine, because people won't come right out and tell you, not even my late ex-husband. This sleuthing of mine continued as I was invited to, shortly after that, I believe that was in 1992 that I went there. A few months later I was invited to an official UNDP government-hosted conference. This was a small conference, much smaller than the Agenda 21 conference. It consisted of, let me see, 12 times 4, yeah, it consisted of 4 dozen groups of experts. There were about 12 groups and 4 each in them. And they were invited to participate in this United Nations Development Program conference. And we were hosted by a government, and that was an interesting experience in and of itself. What happened there is they were discussing the fate of several small countries. And they were planning how these infrastructures were going to exist in those small countries. And one of the people planning there was my husband, and to give you a little background on that is that my ex-husband, he designed the first 5-year plan for India. And you're not going to find that on the internet because Nehru would not have been happy to share, to admit that he did not design his own 5-year plan. But you will, if you sleuth enough, you'll find that what I say is true. And he did that with someone called Professor Mahalanobis. I don't know his first name and I don't really know how to spell that. But he was Nehru's right-hand man and you know, his policy wonk, his policy designer. And that 5-year plan was, you know, non-aligned nation. It was, you know, it was a highly socialist plan. And so he had started, that was his first big gig for the United Nations. So he'd been doing this for a long time. He was part of a small group, and one of the persons in that group with my ex was Princess Basma bint Talal, who is the sister of the King of Jordan. And there was a collection of the great and the good there, very impressive people with tremendous backgrounds in their field, nuclear scientists, you know, you name it, all sorts of people. The only problem with it was these particular nuclear scientists were designing railroad systems for a small African country, or these Jordanian princesses who were in charge of the liberation of women in Muslim countries, and, you know, education of women in Muslim countries, I should say. At the time, she's famous for that cause. Was in there discussing who knows what, you know, the monetary policy of one of these small countries. And so they would go off on their own during the day, and I was in this beautiful palace drinking tea and talking to other wives or other people in the entourage and having a very lovely time. And then in the evenings they would all come out in the late afternoon and they would report to the group what their brainstorming had yielded. And it was very formal. There was a nice big, you know, table with people drinking water and presenting their findings. And this went on and on for, oh, I think 4 days, 5 days, at the end of which they had redesigned the infrastructure of 3 small countries. I had not seen any representatives of those 3 small countries there, and no obvious ones, and in fact there weren't even any covert ones from what I could tell, because the biographies were known of these people. They'd all been introduced, and they weren't from these countries. Well, this was such a friendly meeting, and you know, everybody was so, you know, concerned about the countries, and it was they're so thoughtful and knew a lot about what they thought should be done. And I don't know if I was the only one sitting there thinking, you know, what are these people doing? Are we living in an alternative universe? Is this, you know, the Matrix? I was wondering how it is that these people, so utterly unqualified to have an opinion about certain things, and certainly not elected, how they were designing such important things for other people. And again, this was very official. The United Nations Development Program, I'd like you all to keep an eye on that, is the treasury of the United Nations. It has all the money. Everybody else is just blowing smoke. The UNDP actually does things. And if anybody's worried about the United Nations not doing things and constantly sitting there talking and blowing smoke, that's fine, because they don't care whether you know or not what they're really doing, because the UNDP does it just fine without press or publicity or anything else. And they're basically, from what I saw, they're after the third world countries. I mean, that's what they're redesigning. That doesn't mean if you extrapolate from that, if that's how we're running third world countries, then what are we doing with first world countries? But I leave that to the people in Brussels to explain to you. From what I can tell from the European Union, much the same thing is going on there. And I have my anecdotes about that. And so I'm going to pause here before I go on to the next itty-bitty anecdote and ask you if you have anything to ask me about the United Nations Development Program Conference. Yes, go ahead.
Well, just on what you just said, would you say it's accurate to say that the purpose of the UNDP in working or reorganizing the third world countries is essentially in order to figure out how they were going to exploit the resources of those countries?
Absolutely. It wasn't necessarily clear from that experience, but I have put it together since then, and it matches what I saw. And I have seen statements to that effect by the European Union, who want to make Africa the breadbasket so that they're not dependent on America anymore. And it's the new slavery.
That's the conclusion that I've come to.
It's the new slavery, yes. Yes.
Could you speak to education, how it's linked, or miseducation, or indoctrination, however you want to put it, relating to this, these nations fooling people to believe that they are doing this for the benefit of these little countries?
Yes, that's a long speech, and my it's one of my favorite subjects. So I can get real long-winded with this one, but go ahead.
Briefly.
Yes. I'll just give you a little taste of my background. I grew up in Switzerland. I was born in Santa Barbara. I had a multilingual father, sort of an international type, and I grew up in Switzerland with a German nanny and spoke only German, and went to German public schools until I was 12, and then so I got a good dose of the Swiss public school system, which is better than ours by far, at least it was then. Then I went to boarding schools in Switzerland and in England, and the boarding schools I went to in England and Switzerland, but particularly England, contained the son of the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi. There was a cousin of King Hussein there. There were Egyptian daughters and sons of leaders of Egypt, and there was quite an international crowd there. The school I went to was now called Hurtwood House. It's considered I don't mean to brag, I'm just telling you that it's now considered the foremost coeducational school in England. You know, there's Eton, Harrow, and so on, but they're not coeducational. Well, at least they weren't until recently. I don't think they are now either. So people sent their kids there, and I got to know, you know, that particular crop of people from those nations when I was growing up. And I did get to go to the University of Cambridge in England. I got 2 degrees, a master's and a bachelor's at the University of Cambridge. And I came back here, became a trophy wife, ran around in the places that you just heard about. And then I ran away, because I got really disgusted. I ran away to Maine, and I started working on a schooner. And then I went and became a teacher of French in one of the local high schools here, Mount View High, and that's after spending a winter substituting for the Camden Rockport, Belfast, and Rockland school districts. Then I was accepted to be a teacher at Mount View High, and for all 4 years of high school. And in that capacity, I found out a thing or two about the American school system.
I'm not sure you understood my question. I meant the education coming down from the powers that be to the people in the countries that were being controlled and designed by these other people. How are they educating people there?
Oh, well, take yourselves as an example. They're de-educating us. They're de-educating us.
Are they doing that same thing?
They're doing it here.
Worldwide too?
No, they're doing it to us.
Okay.
So that we produce a populace that is uneducated and unaware of what's really going on. They're doing it to us. They're doing it to themselves as well, but I think it's worse here than anywhere else. And we've now descended down to a third world country level of educational ability. Harvard and Yale, I mean not Yale, Harvard and MIT, the sciences are 50% foreign now. that might be higher than that at this point. There are Chinese, people from India, wonderful people, highly educated people. We cannot fill our Ivy Leagues, our science departments, our engineering departments, anything that requires math. We cannot fill those spots with Americans anymore. We've destroyed our education system. And so that is deliberate. I've come to that conclusion. I've had to come to that conclusion because I've been in these places that I just described. That's one of the reasons I mentioned all that. But I can see that that's deliberate. My family's American. We've been here for 400 years. And my aunt was one of the first people at her little high school to study Attic Greek. My other aunts, from a much humbler background, had a tremendous education in Conneaut, Ohio, on the Pennsylvania border. And they're all in their 80s now. So something has happened to that school system. And my father went to Exeter and was taught a lot of political things there. He was there, William F. Buckley was there, and George Plimpton was there. And they were taught not to speak with big words. They were taught not to speak the way their fathers spoke because that might intimidate the democracy and the working classes, and they were supposed to be more generous than that. They were supposed to speak the way Hemingway writes. Clearly, simply, please don't intimidate anyone with Latinisms because you might offend them. That was and that of course made some sense to, you know, that generation. They didn't want to be prats. So they complied to some degree. They assassinated themselves as a class. That's just an aside. But that's part of the systematic destruction and the propagandization of Western civilization in this country, you know, against Western civilization in this country. It's happening elsewhere too. I was informed not so long ago that the British public school system, for which I never had that much respect, but I am the product of the British, the classical British tradition, which is also being dismantled, by the way. There's things going on at Cambridge University that I have to go and throw up over, but that aside, the English public school system has taken it upon itself no longer to teach the Holocaust as a historical, you know, the Holocaust of the Jews in Germany as a historical event, because it might offend Muslim students. Now there's been, you know, I'm sure that, I know that there are complex views on the subject, but to just decide not to discuss an entire chapter of history because it might offend Muslims, I don't think England is going into a very good direction with that, if you ask me. There's also a removal of trial by jury and habeas corpus in Europe. And you now have hate crime laws where people can come in the middle of the night and take you away because you might be considered nationalist, racist, or having said something against some multicultural element of society there, which is rather frightening. I understand that honor killings are allowed in Canada now. Now these things I'm saying are not just my fantasy, these are all things that are well documented and true. People can kill their daughter or their wives or anybody they wish if they're Muslim in Canada and not be tried for homicide. And so we are living in a very difficult time. So how did we get to this point? I mean, yes, there is constant propagandization. I saw it in Europe. I was warned against it by my, I had a teacher in one of the places I went to. I was barely 18. She had a doctorate from the University of Vienna, and she was a member of the Swedish royal family. And she warned me. She's the one who really started opening my eyes. She put me through a reading list on Eurocommunism. And this was in 1977. And I went to the Council of Europe. By the way, I was there too. I spent several years in Strasbourg, which is in the Alsace, which is the seat of the Parliament, the European Parliament. And while I was there, that's where this woman was. Her name was Yvonne von Stedink. I remember I loved her custom white lancia, and I used to imitate her a little bit. She was like a role model to me. And so I started dressing up after I spent time with her. She took me under her wing. And she sent me over to the Council of Europe and to go to the library, and I did. And I pulled documents that she told me to read about Eurocommunism and explained to me the pyramidical system of Soviet and other kinds of communist system, the top-down thing, which is what you've just seen me talk about with the UNDP. So if anyone tells me that the whole world is going down the toilet because of communist ideas, I'm afraid I have to agree with them. And it's not that simple a subject, though, and I think if we make it too simple, then we're not going to get anywhere with people, because first of all, they don't realize that they're the victims of it, and secondly, they have inoculated themselves with sort of anti-McCarthyism and other sorts of violent protests. They have made us afraid to speak up. So we need to use a different sort of language to be able to get to save the country. Because we're in trouble. Yes?
You said you're teaching in a regular public school now?
I'm not now, no. No, I'm not. No, I did then. Yeah, in
You were,
1998 and 1999.
you're not teaching now?
No, I'm not, no.
Okay. I was worried,
No, I can't-
if you are, your days would be numbered.
Oh,
Or you have a
absolutely.
different persona or something.
Oh, absolutely my days will be numbered, yes, absolutely. No, I ran into things, the first week I was there, I was sitting in the, they had declared my Cambridge degree as the equivalent of a teaching degree in America, and they said that I had to take, I think, 15 credits at the University of Augusta in the summer, education credits where I would be propagandized. And I know this because the taxpayers are paying for teachers' days off. You know, school days, you know, teachers' teaching days. Well, after my experience in the United Nations, this was a very interesting experience to me. It seemed very similar, first of all. So when Charlotte Iserbyt talks about this concerted group effort going into the grassroots areas, you know, going into, let's say, a school district and swaying individuals on the school board, and going into town offices and going here, going there, and creating consensus. That's a favorite United Nations word, consensus. They're doing this on a massive scale. They're doing it everywhere. What happened to me is I'm sitting there, within a month of being there, I'm sitting there on a day off, a teacher's day, teaching day, and someone from Augusta was there all day. And they had little pie charts, and they had little thises, and they had little that's, and they were speaking in the worst kind of what I call governmental style gibberish. The sort that an educational person cannot understand. And I've encountered this before. I don't know if you've encountered this, but American lawyers seem to love to talk that way. A lot of politicians seem to love to talk that way. But it's ultimately gibberish. And my nice little Maine fellow teachers were kind of looking at me. We were sitting at these little round tables, just as in the UNDP, what my husband was doing at the United Nations Development Program. We were sitting at these little round tables, and somebody was, you know, handing out these flyers, and my fellow teachers looked at us, "Do you understand this?" And I said, you know, but they learned it anyway. And I have my theories about that, but it's deliberate obscure, you know, it's obfuscation, it's obscurantism, it's trying to make things as obscure as possible, as unintelligible as possible, so you don't know what the heck you're doing there. And it boiled down to, oh, we're going to do it ended up boiling down to the most simplistic notions. My goodness, the things that we made in the school, K through 12, things sitting there and making little things. But not really learning the skills on how to make things. In Switzerland, they had me knit things and do real things. They were making these little frogs out of cut-out papers. And it was pathetic. It was busy work. I've come to the conclusion that the American school system is a giant babysitting institution designed to de-educate the entire population so that we can no longer understand our own constitution, comprehend our own history, run the world, or create a decent military. In the 70s that my husband knew of, and this was sort of, now they would be Tea Party activists, but this was a conservative person out west that he knew. And they'd left California because they'd protest against the school district against a teacher who was not fired, who had supplied a sample for a biology class from his own body in front of the students. So this has been going on for some time. And, you know, we have, on the surface we have the hippie revolution to thank, but take a look at who was educating the hippies, who was running Berkeley, and who was talking at Harvard. And so they finally got a group of people to listen to them. But they'd been doing this for a long time because my father, God bless him, in 1925 and Annapolis class of 49 had been getting some of this at Exeter, veiled of course, but it was there. And I think he was told that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. And this was in the just before the war, that he was told that. Any questions for me? Did I answer your question?
Yes,
Oh, good.
more or less a demoralization of America.
Oh, yes, yes. John Dewey, I think, started that, wanting to make people little cogs in the wheel, little worker bees. They're very effective at that. I tell you, I came from Europe, and I didn't know what was going on here. And I had to ask myself, why are Americans deliberately destroying their own school system? And it was so obvious, and everywhere. And that's not the only thing that Americans are deliberately destroying. Corporate America. Of course, the left loves to talk about how corporate America is in bed with conservatives, and I don't think that's true. I think the opposite is true, if you ask. The Columbia University allowed, opened its doors to a diversity of people in the 1960s who brought with them a pronounced interest in Marxist-Leninist doctrine, and I think it just took the Ivy League to the next level in that regard. So I think the mid-60s, there was an opening of doors that did some damage, yes.
I just add a little bit inside here that
Yep.
if you're trying to trace back the corruption of the education system, including the colleges and everything, I think you have to go back further, so that probably, if you wanted to start around the turn of the century, the 1910s to 1913 or so,
Yes,
the foundations were instrumental in getting together the educational establishment and corrupting everything. So that it probably, all of the schools, especially Columbia was kind of like the proving ground. Everything went downhill from there.
yes. Well, we also have President Woodrow Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And then we had FDR. The Marxist-Leninist doctrines that are at the root of our problem here. There is an uncertain relationship to truth. There's an uncertain relationship to truth. And I don't want to point fingers just to MBNA, but I did briefly work for them, and I saw it, where we were lied to, the customers were deliberately lied to, presumably the stockholders were lied to, and people were lying to each other, and it was institutionalized. And anybody who's worked there knows this.
I was there when they sold Camden, so right when they fired Cawley and
Cawley, yes, the man who built the thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I found out just this week from an insider that the reason that they fired Cawley was so that Bank of America could buy the place in a hostile takeover.
Yeah, he wanted all
Yeah.
the employees to still have a good job and everything, and then the executives wanted to just sell it and get all the big payout.
Yeah, yeah, that suits. Yeah, I don't think the fault lies with Cawley. The
No.
fault lies with the way business is done, and it is there is no respect for truth.
No.
And the problem with that, and I think there's the same problem that you see with the educational system and the government and the press and just anything you can think of, is that, I mean, there's always been lies and intrigue, and there's been lies in the courts of Europe and so on, but it's okay to get up and quote facts that are absolutely untrue, and not be afraid that someone is going to go find the real fact, because it's all spin. And so there is an uncertain relationship to truth that's going through the entire fabric of society. And I think that the origin of that is Marxist-Leninism. Yes?
And identifying all these different problems you're talking about,
Yeah.
what's your solution?
Oh, I don't know. That's up to all of you, activists.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not qualified to solve the problem. I'm just an eyewitness observer of some of the things that went on in government.